joining me today. I'm Chef Nakia and I am here with you today on our next episode of Chef's Tips to talk about food and wine pairing. So the food that we cook is so delicious and it's great to share with friends and family, and there can be so many complex flavors going on and it can be an entire experience in and of itself. Sometimes those dishes are great to pair with other beverages in order to enhance that dish. One of the most popular beverages to pair with food is wine. And these principles that I'm talking about with food and wine pairing can be applied to other beverages too. But just remember, each beverage has its unique makeup of a flavor profile and characteristics. Be sure to keep that in mind whenever you are pairing food with other beverages. For example, if you are pairing with tea instead of wine, both wine and tea have tonicity. They can have some acidity, but tea will tend to have stronger bitterness notes than what wine would have. And so that bitterness is something that you want to keep in mind as you're pairing the tea with the food. But today we're talking about wine. So to begin, I would love for you to grab a piece of paper and write down some of your favorite wines. You can be as specific or as broad as you'd like. So maybe your favorite wines, you just say, oh, I prefer red wine over white wine. That's fine. Go ahead and just write down red wine. Or maybe you're going to be as specific as saying, ooh, I loved that Grenache Syrah Mourvedre blend from Ballestery. Whatever it is, just go ahead and write down as many as you can think of. If you know off the top of your head maybe why you like that wine so much. Or it may take some time for you to identify the characteristic of the wine that you really enjoy. It might take the research of getting another bottle and taking a sip to see what you like. But it could be the acidity of the wine. It could be flavor notes such as maybe there's a lot of strong berry notes to it. It could be earthy and you like that aspect of it. It could be effervescent and you really like, the bubbles in there. Just go ahead, as much as you can think of, write down next to your favorite wines and then the reasons why you like those wines. Next, go ahead and write down some of your favorite foods and the reasons why you like those foods. And I know, well, for me at least, my list of favorite foods could not fit on a piece of paper, no matter how big that piece of paper is. So you don't have to write down every single favorite food, but think of maybe a dozen. Let's target a dozen, and as you write those down, see if you notice a pattern. So personally, I tend to like more acidic things. I really look for the acidity in a dish to balance the other flavors. So if you're someone who likes acidity, you might tend to like vinaigrettes on your salads as opposed to maybe creamier dressings. You may also be that person who, whenever you make tacos, you have to have some fresh lime to squeeze on top because you love that extra, zesty citrus note and sour element. So just look to see if you can see a pattern. Maybe you tend to really enjoy salty things or sweet. Also, this could be textures or feelings also. So it doesn't just have to be the flavor. You might enjoy creamy, you might enjoy crunchy, you could enjoy spicy, or maybe comforting or refreshing. Think outside of just flavors and textures. Think about maybe the way that food makes you feel too. And so just write down the first things that come to mind of why you like what your favorite foods are. And by making this list and noticing our flavor preferences, we will be able to better understand our palate, and then that will help us as we're going to pair food and wine so that we can really look at what we think is going to be the most important element for us to focus on whenever we're pairing that food and wine. The more that you can learn about your palate and your flavor preferences, the better you'll be able to plan and personalize a meal to be as best as it can for you. And personal preference wins every time. Doesn't matter if anyone else likes it or not. If you're making it for you, then your personal preference, and if you really enjoyed it, that is all that matters. So one of the first things we want to think about when we think about wine is we want the food and the wine to complement each other. We don't want them to overpower one another. We don't want them like competing for the focus of your taste buds. We want lighter wines with lighter foods and richer wines with richer foods. So what is a light wine or a rich wine? Like, what if you're not even familiar with that? So are light wines just white wines? Is that? So white wines will tend to be lighter than reds. However, not every white wine is the same lightness. And not every red wine is going to be really rich and stand up to fattier, bolder flavors. So some examples of lighter wines. For whites, we've got like Sauvignon Blancs, we've got Gruner Veltliners, Pinot Grigio. Those three are really pretty light, clean white wines. For red wines, on the lighter side, you could choose a Pinot Noir or a Gamay. Those are going to be better to pair with dishes like maybe chicken or pork or seafood. Now, your richer wines, it is still hard to find like a rich white wine. Some of your oaked Chardonnays are going to be the closest that you can get. A rich Chardonnay, the richest Chardonnay is still probably not going to be as rich as some of these red wines that I'm about to list off. However, if you look at the whites from a lighter to a richer, the Chardonnay is going to be on the richer end. And then if you have your reds down here, right, these light ones might be starting here, eclipse the Chardonnay, and then your bolder wines will be over here. So some of those really bold, full-bodied red wines are Cabernet Sauvignon, Mourvedre, and Syrah. Another indication of the richness of a wine can be the climate in which the grapes were grown. So your cooler climates are going to tend to produce lighter wines, and your warmer climates will produce richer wines, and that has a lot to do with the sun's exposure on the skin of the grape and the amount of sugar and then alcohol that it can create. There are 4 main characteristics about wine that we're going to talk about. There are a multitude of notes of wines, right? They're very complex, and so there's endless true characteristics, but these 4 are the ones that we want to focus on whenever we are pairing, and that is acidity, sweetness, tonicity, and the alcohol percentage. All right, so a lot of people are very familiar with sweetness. It's a flavor that as kids, a lot of times we really look for in food. So sweetness is usually something that we taste on the tip of our tongue. Sweet wines typically are going to be served either before the meal or like at the beginning of the meal or after the meal or at the very end of the meal. So a lot of your sweet wines are not going to pair very well with those main dishes. You can use some sweet wine to balance the richness in a food. However, a lot of times people will look for a wine higher in tonicity to balance that richness. We'll talk about that more later. But some good bites that you might want to pair with your sweet wines would be, there's a plethora of cheeses, but especially like saltier, some saltier, lighter bites. Cured meats are a good one. And then sometimes you can enjoy a sweet wine with a sweet dessert. For some people, that can get to be overly sweet. However, other times, especially I find if the dessert is a little bit lighter on the sweet end and maybe full of fruit, it can really pair well with a sweeter wine. Sweet wines also sometimes are great just for like after you're done eating to kind of cleanse your palate and say, all right, meal is done, it's complete. Our second characteristic we'll talk about is acidity. So the acidity we're gonna feel more in the middle of our mouths. Acidity can be kind of like a sting that fades quickly. Other times it can gently build throughout your sip of wine. So just be aware that different types of acidity will be felt a little bit differently in your mouth. Acidity in a wine can balance the sweetness, saltiness, or fattiness of dishes, of your food. Personally, I do like pairing richer, fattier foods with an acidic wine because to me, the acidity cuts through the fattiness and creates a more refreshing overall pairing. Some examples of acidic wines are Sauvignon Blanc, Chenin Blanc, Petit Syrah, and Grenache. And with that conversation about like fattier foods, especially fried foods, I find that a sparkling wine pairs really well with fried food. With fried foods, that oil is going to coat your mouth, and then the bubbles in a sparkling wine are going to come in and kind of break that up. And I just really enjoy the effervescence, and especially if it is a little bit more acidic, sparkling wine with those fried foods. Our third characteristic is tonicity in wines. If you have heard about a wine being tannic, but you didn't quite know what that meant, don't worry, this is the one a lot of people are the least familiar with. So what tonicity feels like in your mouth is going to be around your gums, and it kind of feels like the wine is drying out your gums. If you move your tongue to between like your cheek and your gum, it's going to feel almost like your tongue is like sticky. I know it sounds really weird, but I promise you that there is tannins. They come from the skin of the grape, and they are important in a wine and to balance the alcohol and other flavors. So your wines that are higher in tannins can create a really great contrast for fatty foods. Personally, I do prefer pairing juicier or saucy foods with tannic wines, and that is because of that drying effect. Whenever I eat something juicy, it kind of counteracts that. And juicy isn't necessarily just like the juice of a fruit, right? This can include juicy cuts of meat, and then saucy pastas I think are a great starting point if you are looking for a dish to pair a tannic wine with. A few examples of tannic wines are Nebbiolo, Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Sangiovese, and Malbec. So whenever you drink one of these wines next time, really pay attention to that feeling in order to get more familiar with what tannins are and what a wine that is high in tannins feels like. And our fourth component of flavor of a wine is the alcohol percent. So it's not just there to alter your mood and brain function, right? It actually has an important part in the flavor of the wine. So your higher alcohol wines, you're going to feel it more as like a burn. If your wine is not balanced and it's pretty high in alcohol, it will be pretty obvious based on how it feels when it hits your tongue, and then after you swallow, if you can still feel some of that residual heat from the alcohol, then it's a pretty high alcohol wine. Now, the other three characteristics of wine balance out the alcohol in a well-structured wine. So a higher alcohol content wine is going to have another characteristic that is pretty strong in order to make it drinkable and enjoyable. So tannins are one of the characteristics that are oftentimes going to be higher in relation to the alcohol. Another way you can build body is with acidity. So some wines will be higher in acidity to make up for that higher alcohol content. And then sweetness is the third way. So some of those sweet wines, think, like a port, the sweetness of that wine is there to balance the higher alcohol content. So some of your softer wines typically are going to be lower in alcohol. So whenever you are going to pair food with the wine, I recommend focusing on those other three characteristics. Know that alcohol plays a factor, but you're not going to be able to look at like the alcohol percentage on a label and say, oh, this is going to be great to pair with some lamb and a chimichurri sauce. It all depends on what aspect of that wine is balancing that percentage. So that is the basic structure of wine and how to pair wine with food. Now I want you to take that knowledge plus the flavor characteristics that you noticed you prefer in food and wines to craft your food and wine pairing. So if you know that you tend to enjoy acidity, then you can go and pick out a wine that you like because it's higher in acidity, and then think, okay, what kind of dish might I want to create that's maybe a little bit on the saltier side, so that I can see how the acidity of the wine and the saltiness of the dish interact. With acidity, so the more acidic your food, usually the more acidic your wine, because weird things happen in your mouth whenever your food ends up being more acidic than your wine. So just keep that in mind. And then same with like, maybe you want a really rich steak dinner and you want to experiment with a tannic wine. That would be a great combination to try out. So if you're looking at that list and maybe you don't really know exactly what you like about food, like you're still really getting to know your own palate, and so you don't know if it's necessarily going to be the best guide yet, I have a couple more tips for how you can get started food and wine pairing and experimenting. So first is to look at the region where your food or your wine came from, and then pick the opposite, but from that region. So if you have a wine from Milan, Italy, think about what food is popular in that area, and that can start giving you some ideas of some dishes that you can pair with that wine. Regions that boast a lot of wine production over time have produced wines in relation to the earth and the region that they are in. So the growing conditions of the grapes do a lot for the character of the wine, and that wine oftentimes over time just gets more and more specific in its like personality of the wine. And as that's happening, a lot of foods from that region are being created, and you're probably gonna drink a wine from that region when you're making your food. And so the foods have just naturally been over years made to suit the personality of those wines. So like as time goes on, the food and the wine end up just getting even more complementary of each other. So that is why I recommend, if you feel stuck, if you are thinking of a certain region of the world, you can pick out the food and the wine from that region, and oftentimes they will go well together. Another clue could be reading the label. Sometimes some of these wine labels, they'll say on there, this pairs really well with X, Y, and Z. So take a look at the label and see if they give you any ideas for your meal. And then we started with this list of wines we like and foods that we like, but feel free to buy a journal and keep a wine journal. Anytime you taste a wine, and write it down, maybe write the vintage, and if you know the exact grapes in it, because sometimes we may have a blended wine, so we may or may not know everything that is in that wine. But if you know what it is, write it down, and then just write down your thoughts and feelings about it. And it could be one sentence, it could be 3 paragraphs. Writing these things down and then being able to go back and reference them will just help you learn your palate better and understand what your food and wine preferences are. And then the last tip is have fun and experiment. Keep experimenting. So you won't know for sure if you like something unless you try it. And this can be a really fun part of the journey. So consider, if you really want to like take one day and learn a lot about your flavor preferences with food and wine. Consider purchasing 1 or 2 different wines and then several different like snacks or bites. You could cook if you wanted to. You could cook several different things, or you could just purchase some pre-made items. Think about having something that's predominantly salty, something that's sweet, something that's creamy, all of these different flavor elements, and then take a sip of wine and take a bite of a specific food, and just let them hang out in your mouth and just see what you notice, right? There will be some foods that bring out really interesting characteristics in your wine and vice versa. And if you have 2 different wines, then what's interesting is the same food can bring out different characteristics in the different wines, and then your perception of that food might change based on the wine that you are drinking. So I think it's very fascinating and very interesting and so much fun. So just to recap, top 2 out of all of them, the top 2 tips for wine and food pairing is know your flavor preferences and let that be your guide. And if you like it, that is what matters. Number 2, have fun with it and keep experimenting. Chefeteers, thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope that you have a lot of fun coming up with some culinary adventures and maybe even some wine adventures. We'll see you soon.